The Second Battle of Fallujah, codenamed Operation Phantom Fury, was an American-led offensive of the Iraq War that started on the 7th of November 2004 and lasted approximately 6 weeks. Phantom Fury also marked the highest point of the conflict against Iraqi insurgents and was the bloodiest action of the Iraq War. It was a joint military effort carried out by the United States, the Iraqi interim government, and the United Kingdom. Within the city of Fallujah, the coalition was led by the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Army. The battle would later go on to be described as, quote, some of the heaviest urban combat the U.S. military has been involved in since the Battle of Hue City in Vietnam in 1968. A religious center with over 200 mosques, Fallujah had been the center for Baathism in Iraq. Located in the Sunni Triangle west of Baghdad, it housed several important offices during Saddam's regime. During the 1980s, chemical munitions were manufactured and stored in the region. The American occupation got off to a rocky start, after some incidents between American troops and civilians in the aftermath of the 2003 invasion. During a standoff on the 28th of April 2003, gunfire was exchanged between U.S. forces and a crowd. Some reports stated that U.S. forces began shooting first. Other sources claimed the first shots came from the crowd, of what looked like civilians. Regardless of who fired first, 17 civilian deaths were recorded on this day. The events that transpired on the 28th of April soured the already fragile relationship between U.S. forces and the local population. As relations deteriorated, attacks on coalition personnel increased, until the 31st of March 2004, when 4 Blackwater contractors were killed, and also 5 American soldiers in Habanaya west of Baghdad were also killed. By this point, the U.S. military had withdrawn its forces from the city itself to the outskirts, in hopes that the local population and their leaders would police the city and keep the peace on their own. This, however, is not what happened. Once the U.S. military pulled back to the city outskirts, elements of the Iraqi insurgents began to fill the power vacuum left behind. It became very clear very quickly for the United States that if they wanted to clear Fallujah and capture the insurgents responsible for the March 31st attacks, they were going to have to go into Fallujah and take them by force. U.S. Marines commenced what would become the First Battle of Fallujah, Operation Vigilant Resolve, to do exactly that. This operation began on the 4th of April 2004. The Marines hoped that the Iraqi National Guard would participate, lending more legitimacy in the eyes of the population. But on the dawn of the attack on Fallujah, the Iraqi National Guard threw down their weapons and deserted. This wouldn't be the first time that the Iraqi National Guard had refused to take military action against fellow Iraqis and had deserted, or allegedly even aided the resistance. Despite the loss of the Iraqi National Guard, the Marines fought valiantly, fighting street to street, house to house, quickly overrunning a quarter of the city and killing hundreds of insurgents. But the operation was a public relations disaster. Civilian casualties had been expected, but the numbers were excessively high. Support from the local Iraqi government low, and the political will to complete the operation no longer existed. Under pressure from the Iraqi Governing Council, Vigilant Resolve was called off at the end of April in 2004, and U.S. troops withdrew from the city. Estimates of the number of Iraqi deaths total about 730, with around 40 coalition troops killed in action. An Iraqi mediation team entered the city in an attempt to set up negotiations between U.S. forces and local leaders. The United States forces ostensibly sought to negotiate a settlement, but promised to restart its offensive to retake the city if one was not reached. Military commanders said their goal in the siege was to capture those responsible for the numerous deaths of United States and Iraqi security personnel. The agreement reached was that the locals would eject the insurgents and the Americans would therefore withdraw. This agreement was always destined to fail. Throughout the summer of 2004, Iraqi militias and foreign insurgent volunteers streamed into the city. Intelligence briefings given prior to battle reported that coalition forces would encounter Chechen, Filipino, Saudi, Libyan, and Syrian combatants, as well as native Iraqis. Defensive works were constructed, and IEDs and booby traps were readied. Houses were rigged with explosives, and the insurgents devised elaborate methods to funnel Americans into prepared kill zones. The insurgents holding Fallujah were formidable. They had interpreters, combat cameramen, and were well trained. Many were battle-hardened. Insurgents were equipped with a variety of advanced small arms, and had captured a variety of U.S. armament, including M14s, M16s, body armor, uniforms, uniforms, and even helmets. While the insurgents prepared the city for the inevitable siege that was to come, the coalition had been preparing as well, hitting targets throughout the city with artillery and airstrikes, and using drones to create sophisticated maps of the city. Coalition planners saw Fallujah as an opportunity to contain and destroy a large contingent of the insurgent force. Fallujah was encircled. Most of the civilians were allowed to flee, but some news agencies reported that allegedly unarmed fighting-age males were prevented from leaving. However, this could not be confirmed. Due to the population being allowed to evacuate the city, the likelihood of civilian casualties was greatly reduced, as an estimated 90% of the population fled the coming assault. The plan of attack was simple. American and Iraqi special forces would provide a diversion on the night before, and the US Marine Corps would take the insurgents head-on the next day after a barrage of artillery and air power, with the famous Black Watch of the British Army helping to seal off the city. The codename would be Operation Phantom Fury. Phantom Fury began on the night of the 7th of November 2004 and quickly devolved into savage close-quarter street fighting with concealed sniper nests. Both sides employed new tactics. Iraqi insurgents attempted to use pre-laid bombs to blow up entire buildings with squads of Marines inside, while the Americans sparked controversy by using white phosphorus rounds to flush out stubborn defenders. In one notorious incident, wounded US Marines became trapped inside what would become known as the Hell House. A vicious 4-hour-long firefight commenced as the Marines attempted to extract their wounded on the first floor, while insurgents fired down on them from the second floor. The Marines prevailed, but only after suffering 10 wounded and 1 killed in action. Battles such as the Hell House would be fought over and over again all across Fallujah, as the Marines advanced building by building and room by room throughout the city. US Marines oftentimes forced off the streets by flurries of rocket-propelled grenades and rifle fire. They adopted the tactic of mouse-holing, or blowing holes in walls so they could move between structures and avoid areas that had been zeroed by insurgents, or to circumvent booby-trap doors. Interestingly enough, this was a tactic used by the Soviets in World War II against German troops in some cities. The Americans would blast heavy metal and bizarre noises at night as a form of psychological warfare, including a distorted recording of the laugh of the creature from the movie Predator. The latter was so unsettling that the Marines themselves requested that PSYOPs knock it off. As this disturbing symphony played, AC-130 gunships circled overhead, picking off targets of opportunity in the dark. The outcome of the battle was never in doubt, and most of the fighting was over by the end of the first week. Pockets of resistance remained until mid-December. The victory, however, was a hollow one. Coalition forces had taken Fallujah, but the city was utterly destroyed. Coalition forces suffered a total of 107 killed in action and 613 wounded. Estimates of insurgent casualties were complicated, but most estimates placed the number of insurgents killed at around 1,500 to 2,000. Coalition forces also captured approximately 1,500 insurgents during the operation. Of these casualty numbers, the vast majority were sustained in the first 10 days of frantic fighting. It quickly became apparent that high-value insurgents like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi had managed to escape. And while the US had overpowered the city, Fallujah was far from tame. Hostility would continue to simmer and occasionally sputter into outright violence until the city was handed over to the Iraqi government. Politically, both in the United States and in Iraq, the battle was a chilling wake-up call. The twin battles were the first major combat against an Iraqi insurgency, as opposed to the forces of the now deposed Saddam Hussein, and the fighting was far more brutal. Fallujah suffered extensive damage to residents, mosques, city services, and businesses. The city, once referred to as the City of Mosques, had over 200 pre-battle mosques, of which 60 or so were destroyed in the fighting. Many of these mosques had been used as arms caches and weapon strongpoints for insurgent forces. Of the roughly 50,000 buildings in Fallujah, between 7,000 and 10,000 were estimated to have been destroyed in the offensive, and up to 70% of the remaining buildings had notable damage. Nevertheless, the battle proved to be less than the decisive engagement that the US military had hoped for. Some of the non-local insurgents, along with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, were believed to have fled before the military assault, leaving mostly local militants behind. Subsequent US military operations against insurgent positions were ineffective at drawing out insurgents into another open battle, and by September of 2006, the situation had deteriorated to the point that Al-Anbar province that contained Fallujah was reported to be in total insurgent control by the US Marine Corps, with the exception of now pacified Fallujah, but now with an insurgent-plagued Ramadi.